Good afternoon. My name is Joe Padock, and I'm going to discuss with you my research project concerning undecided voters in the 2016 election. Again, this is from the Applied Research Methods course here at Youngstown State. So every 4 years we go through the act of trying to elect a president, and every 4 years we focus on undecided voters and what they want to know and what we need to tell them. So I've always been troubled by the fact that undecided voters take up so much of our time and that they could sway the polls back and forth on a single news event. And it's always been troubling how fickle some people could be. I think most of us are probably partisan, and we just hope our candidate doesn't blow it more than we worry about so much what they're going to say, because we kind of understand their policies from the get-go. So I really wanted to set out and find out why they're so indecisive, undecided voters are so indecisive, and what type of information they're looking for, and how they actually come to their conclusions. While driving down State Route 43, I actually did see an undecided voters yard sign, and I almost crashed the car as I stopped and went back to take a picture of that, which I found very interesting. So for my briefing today, this is the outline I'll follow. I'll start out with a literature review. We'll look at, excuse me. There we go. We'll start out with a literature review and look at the research question, take a look at research methods in general, an overview of the research methods, and then we'll talk about the results, some discussion, and then we'll look at the conclusion and future study as well. So in the literature review, there were some common themes that came out across all the literature, or across a lot of the research. There's a lot of research that has been done on undecided voters. One of the big topics is implicit and explicit attitudes. That is, the attitudes that undecided voters unconsciously have. A lot of research has gone into this to determine that really implicit attitudes about a candidate are already determined in a lot of undecided voters. And a lot of researchers like Lindbergh and Payne in 2014, and Galdi, Arcuri, and Gonrowski in 2008 determined that these implicit, that is not conscious attitudes about candidates were already developed in undecided voters. So they in fact had already made a decision. Kosmides was another researcher that looked at civic duty as a driving force as to what drove undecided voters, and he found that civic duty was actually more important than party affiliation. What we really found in the research was that there was an endless information gathering. A study by Kimsey and Hans in 1708 determined that undecided voters were constantly looking for reams of information but not coming to any conclusions about who they would vote for. So they had an agenda of things they were looking for, but they didn't really follow it. So there was also, some studies looked at the bandwagon effect, which was mostly disproven. That is to say that undecided voters are just waiting to see who's winning and then jumping on the bandwagon. But they found that that actually was not true. But there was some research that did justify momentum in an election, so that as a candidate was showing strong strength towards the end of the campaign, that undecided voters did tend to turn towards those candidates. So this leads us to our research question of, how do undecided voters process various data, including news, media, advertising, polls, and public opinion, to determine their voting choice for president? So we're really looking at, what is it they're looking at? In our research, we decided to look at several research methods. We looked at a historical piece in which we examined, we'll talk about the history of polling in America. Archival will look at 3 different elections to see what the opinions of undecided voters were during those elections. The focus group will look at a focus group conducted during the 3rd presidential debate for 2016, and an ethnographic study looks at the comment section for an article that was done on undecided voters. Through all of these methods, I used the same analysis method. I used a conventional open method. I wasn't looking for one particular theme, but I wanted to look at what themes emerged from the research. So throughout, it was conventional and open. As far as historical results went, we looked back at the history of polling, went back to around 1824, when polling results were really starting to be published in the newspapers. They had found that at the time, in the early 1800s, the 1824 election had a candidate who was both candidates were Republican Democrats. That is, there wasn't one on one side or the other. So they both came from the same party. So there was really a lot of confusion as to how people were going to vote for those candidates, which really started this polling. They did polls by raising hands at 4th of July celebrations, or in bars there was a polling book where people said who they were going to vote for. Military musters, where young white males had to show up for a muster, they would poll those people. By the turn of the 20th century, they determined that advertisers were looking for a way to determine what public opinion was, which really kind of led us to 1935 and George Gallup, who established the American Institute of Public Opinion. Gallup really made a name for himself in the 1936 election when he predicted FDR would win, when everybody else was saying that Alfred Landon, the polling people at the time, said that Landon was going to win that election. FDR did struggle in his presidency with the public, though historically we know him as a very popular president. But he wanted to really establish himself well with the press and with the public. And so he hired this guy by the name of Emil Hersa, who was a leader of the Democratic National Committee, who really did a lot of polling for FDR and some of his policies. One of the interesting people we meet in the history is a guy by the name of Robert Wirthlin, who worked for Reagan for the entire time Reagan was in public office. And Wirthlin really spent a lot of time, he spent years developing this political information system to determine what messages would resonate with people. And one of the ones that resonated for Reagan was this family, neighbor, work, peace, freedom. Those were the 5 words that Wirthlin determined were good for Reagan in his acceptance speech in 1980. And you know, Reagan was known as the great communicator, which in fact was part of Wirthlin's legacy as well. Archivally, I looked at the 2000, 2008, 2016 elections. The reason I looked at those 3 was because they were all incumbents. So there was nobody who said, oh, I voted for Obama last time, I'm going to vote for him again, or I voted for Bush. So there was no incumbent for those elections. I focused on the New York Times, the Post, and the Washington Post, and the New York Post. And those are the articles. I looked at articles that concerned undecided voters during those elections. And the themes that emerged was, again, as the Lip Review pointed to, undecided voters were constantly seeking new information, constantly looking for information on their candidates, yet coming to no conclusions. A guy by the name of Alan Wolf wrote an article called The Tyranny of Undecided Voters, in which he says that they're weightless, shifting from candidate to another based on gestures and impressions. So there was some frustration, which we'll see also in the ethnographic study, frustration from decided people about undecided voters. Again, archivally, even through these 3 elections, a lot of nitpicking. Obama looked presidential, McCain looks old and tired. Not a lot of discussion from undecided voters on specific topics. There was a lot of cry for, I need specifics, I really do need specifics. That was somebody's comment about George Bush, who failed to answer a question completely and felt that he couldn't support him because of that. Another person said that George Bush was too average a person and that they weren't supporting him yet because you had to be extraordinary to be president, and they hadn't seen that in it. An interesting archival discovery was the Palin factor, which I called the Palin factor. When Sarah Palin was picked as John McCain's running mate, it flipped the polls in his favor by 20 points overnight. So it was an incredible factor. But a month later, Palin had, they said that Palin was drawing down the Republican ticket. So I think archivally we see that there wasn't much change. The attitudes were really nitpicking and people really weren't committed, and there was no theme or message that was committing them. The focus group was really on the presidential debate of 2016 out of Las Vegas, in which Frank Luntz sat down with 26 undecided voters pre and post debate. And again, we find that same theme about people nitpicking. Nutt starts the focus group with, how the hell can you be so undecided? He said in frustration, in which the group really laughed. And they gave a lot of varying opinions that were kind of inaudible. But a lot of people said that there was talk about they didn't know the plans, they're waiting for an October surprise, it's the same old lies, it's the same old thing. Not a lot of discussion about policy. People weren't concerned about policy issues, they were concerned about personality issues. And that was a common theme throughout the focus group. Words to describe Trump after the third debate: blowhard, inadequate, passionate, and rude. Words for Hillary Clinton: presidential, confident, a snooze fest, more believable, and a criminal actor. Again, focusing on who those people were and not much. One frustrating thing about the focus group was that Luntz never asked them if the debate changed their opinion on who they were going to vote for. In the ethnographic study, we looked at an article about undecided voters to take a look at the comment section. The comments were really very varied, but there was a lot of good comments about the actual election process, about undecided voters. A lot of the comments focused on people's disdain or dislike for undecided voters. One man said talking to undecided voters like being enclosed in a room with a monkey and a machine gun, which didn't seem to make sense, but it was interesting enough. Fed up with the precious flowers that are undecided voters. So there was a lot of, this is the first time in the research that I'd seen that people were really upset about the attention that undecided voters get. Not a lot of undecided voters commenting. One said, "Go pound sand, you self-righteous, condescending something." So there was some backlash for that. But the ethnographic comments from this article were very interesting and insightful, giving candidates advice. There was a discussion about the shy Trumpers who really didn't want to vote for Trump, but were going to vote for Trump, but were afraid to tell anybody that they were going to do that. So finally, what I've concluded is that undecided voters will always be a focus for every election, and they will continually look for information. Poor candidates are left with trying to determine how to influence these people. Donald Trump hit a gold mine when he focused on the anger of middle-class white men, and Hillary Clinton just could not find that group of people that she needed to get to. So again, an endless search for clarification and more information, a lot of nitpicking in all of the focus method, in all of the research methods. There was a lot of nitpicking from undecided voters about the candidates. Implicit attitudes were revealing but difficult to determine. A lot of angry reaction from decided voters, and really inconclusive results as to what undecided voters are actually looking for and what determined their vote. I tend to believe that they decided once they walked into the voting booth. And for future research, it would be interesting to really focus on pre- and post-election surveys for an actual election, and really a focus, I think an interesting research project would be these silent Trumpers and that phenomenon that occurred during the 2016 election.